enabled. Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2.
Hello and welcome to the Thought League. Today we are going to discuss the strength of ethical capital. That's right. This is a new way of evaluating companies, and post the pandemic world, how ethics have been evolving and changing. To deep dive into this thought leadership discussion today, we have with us two gentlemen joining in with their ideas of change and the present scenario. Let me welcome on the Thought League Dr. Simon Longstaff, the Executive Director at the Ethics Centre, joining us straight from Sydney, and Cyril Shroff, the Managing Partner at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Gentlemen, so good to have you on CNBC TV18. Now, Simon, first question to you. What do we mean by the strength of ethical capital?
Well, one of the things that investors in particular are interested in, but also other stakeholders, is the degree to which you can actually predict the conduct of a corporation. And to do that, you need to know the degree to which there's alignment between what it says it stands for itself, and also the extent to which it accords with the expectations of society. And you take those two things together, and the level of alignment amounts to ethical capital, the basis on which you can make judgments about the reliability of what a company says and what it will actually do. And it has a huge impact then on risk-adjusted returns.
That's right. And Cyril Shroff, we've discussed at length about the purpose of a corporation and its main idea of generating profit for all the stakeholders. How is now this new concept different, and is the sustainability thrust across the world really giving weightage to the ethical capital?
Thanks, Nisha. This is an incredibly important discussion and great to have Simon on the show. So I think this conversation about ethical capital is way larger than just sustainability. I think it is a far more deep-rooted philosophy on the basis of which private enterprise or any sort of enterprise could be founded. An ethical capital, in my belief, is as old as capital itself. Now, whether you look at some of the the doctrines of Adam Smith, or you go back to Indian philosophy and sort of spiritual history, whether in the Vedas, Gita, or even Jainism, you will find the philosophical roots of ethical capital and ethical behavior very deep-rooted. So this is not new to us at all. There has been, in relatively more modern times, Gandhiji also propounded this. I think his concept of trusteeship is essentially based on the concept of ethical capital. And in today's times, which are so volatile, there is so much money floating around. There are huge temptations because of greed. This concept is more important than ever before. So I completely resonate with Simon's observations that we need to look at the market and look at enterprises and businesses through the lens of their performance on ethical capital. And it's hard to sort of find an index that kind of measures it, but you know it when you see it.
That's right. And in fact, the huge thrust towards the ESG governance that has really come in, there again, we are trying hard to get the matrices right and get the template right for benchmarking the companies. But Simon, ethics has been a given. The companies have to follow these rules. Why is it that right now we need to specify this and evaluate the companies on the basis of this? And how is it much deeper than the ESG concept?
Well, Nisha, that's a fantastic set of questions there. Of course, I think it's not a given that ethics has been applied in businesses across the world. What has been confused for ethical commitments has been a commitment to compliance. So society will establish various rules and regulations, whether expressed in the form of legislation or codes, and you will see a number of companies that will do what they need to do in order to conform with those requirements. But this is about something deeper, It's about working out what is the purpose of your organisation, how does that relate to the core values and principles, and what is it that you would choose to do even if no one is watching, even if there is no requirement. And the reason why alignment with those expectations is so important, if just you look in purely economic terms, is that when you get this operating as it ought to, with high alignment comes high trust, and that equals low cost. Now, of course, ESG has made huge inroads, and it's incredibly important that investors and managers and others are looking at it. But the problem with it at the moment is that the E and the S and the G are not necessarily integrated, and certainly not integrated not just between themselves, but with the ordinary day-to-day activities of the business. So what provides the glue that connects all of those things together and allows managers, investors and other stakeholders to make informed judgments is the ethical capital. That is the quality of the alignment between what the company says it stands for and does, and what it does in relation to the expectations of society. It's a new idea, it's a challenging idea, but it's something whose day has come.
That's right, the time has come. It's, as you rightly said, Simon, it is probably the fundamental basis on which the company operates on all fronts. Now, ESG is something which we are talking about a little more in a pronounced way in a post-pandemic world. Cyril Shroff, while we are still finding it difficult to get the ESG going right, the investors are looking for valued companies on the basis of ESG, and we are already talking about greenwashing. How will ethics then seep into the system in such a context?
So that's a great question, and if I can kind of build upon something which Simon said. So greenwashing is kind of faking it. So the entire sort of current consciousness on ESG, I think, is a little bit of a shorthand for acceptable corporate behavior, but it doesn't go to the depth of really providing the glue between the E, S, and the G, and providing almost like a true north which the company will follow or the business will follow in terms of how it conducts itself, both internally with reference to its people and internal stakeholders, and in the market. What does it really stand for? So, just an ESG evaluation, or these days you get a rating as well, is not going to give you that answer. It will give you some kind of either a compliance score, or depending on the rating, it will give you a little bit higher on some details in relation to each of the components. But it's not going to give you the soul of the enterprise. So the time for evaluating and finding a methodology for the ethical capital of the corporation, and it's an abstract idea, but at the same time, it's not that difficult to experience or to appreciate, because you kind of know ethical enterprise when you see one.
That's right. It's an idea which cannot be judged, but of course, the perception building, I would say, Cyril Shroff, in itself is a very important defining factor when it comes to the ethics, and that has been going on. But how to really put it down on paper is something we'll struggle with. But Simon, help us understand, how do you distinguish this theory from the license to operate?
Well, it's part of a larger change that's taking place. I mean, there's been an evolution in the whole notion of corporate responsibility, which is going back over decades now. License to operate was, and still is in some circles, a popular notion. It's the idea that in order to be able to operate in a society, you effectively pay the license fee. You accord with certain standards, you make certain contributions, whether it's through the payment of taxes or the offering of employment. But it's very much a transactional idea. It evolved a little bit under the work of people like Michael Porter and Kramer in their Harvard Business Review article, where they talked about the notion of shared value. That is, businesses are in society going about their business, and the value they create is shared back to society. But it's effectively one in which businesses are still left as being almost like a parasite, a self-interested parasite that is feeding on the environment but making a contribution. The latest thinking, though, goes beyond that. It says, actually, no, business is not outside of society. It's not a parasite. It's actually part of the body of society. And I suppose the best analogy to use is to think about the relationship between a heart and a body in a human body. The heart must be healthy, it must be pumping, but it depends for its health on the health of the body, as the body also depends on the health of the heart. So this is about moving away from a transactional basis in which you pay your license fee and then get on with what you're doing, or where you are just narrowly self-interested, to one which is much more about relationships. Relationships with the communities in which you're based, with the customers you serve, with the shareholders whose funds you use, and so forth. And I think Cyril Shroff was harking back to some of the more ancient roots of Indian philosophical thinking.
Yes.
And I think it's just a natural place to begin for understanding corporations in that sense of relationship, rather than those older notions which are now being replaced.
That's right, relationship with the overall ecosystem, and therefore looking at the common interest of the overall ecosystem is everybody grows and you grow with it. That's the main takeaway coming in, Simon, from what you said, and leaving away the parasitic approach. But even the digital thrust and the revolution that we have seen across the world also has to lead to collaboration ultimately for all the participants to gain.
It does, and it's about this sense of relationship collectively bringing to the mutual good. It's not about anyone becoming impoverished or giving up the opportunity to build sustainable profits. It's about recognising the human nature of these connections. And we've tended in many parts of the world, including where I live, to think more mechanistically, more transactionally than is actually faithful to the reality of human progress.
That's right. And Cyril Shroff, very quickly, I mean, while in India especially, where we stay, you know, the world is divided so starkly between haves and have-nots. How easy is it to be so symbiotic, where everybody is trying to capture the limited resources we have?
That's a great question, particularly, you know, in a society like India, which is full of so many contradictions and full of so much inequality. So I have a little bit more reasonable ambition and expectation on that. I don't think, you know, any one stakeholder or any one part of society, namely I'm just looking at business as one, can solve the whole problem. It's impossible. I think multiple stakeholders, including the state and including the citizenry itself, have to work together to alleviate our deepest problems, including of poverty. I think the private sector business can only make that much of a difference, but it can lead the way in many respects, because it has the freedom of action, it has resources, it has distributed leadership across so many businesses and so many sectors. So I think we have to find a way of how these different elements of society can collaborate.
That's right, Cyril Shroff. In fact, we'll lift off from where we left in the next segment. We'll take a short break and we'll discuss, is ethics a luxury in a fiercely competitive world? We'll discuss that with our thought leaders on the Thought League. Stay tuned.
Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2.
Welcome back. You're watching the Thought League, and we are discussing the ethical capital and the strength of it, and valuing the companies as well as the overall ecosystem through this particular lens. Simon, we have touched upon many points, but tell us about the moral fatigue and the moral injury in this context.
Well, I think everybody throughout the world has been experiencing the effects of the global pandemic. And for many people in government, but also in the private sector, they've been required to make a series of very challenging decisions, not just once, not just twice, but over and over again as they respond to this circumstance. And that gives rise to a phenomenon known as moral fatigue. It's a bit like somebody being worn down over time by the relentless necessity of the choices they make. And it's a difficult thing to handle, but it is also the source of a much more dangerous set of situations. And that is when you make a decision which in the future you then look back and regret, and that can give rise to moral injury. And moral injury can be so profound that it can destabilise a person's life. It can even give rise in some harsh cases to suicide. So what we've started to realise is that in business, just as in other parts of life, we need to strengthen the capacity, the resilience of people both to make these increasingly frequent ethical decisions, but also to make them with sufficient skill that they don't expose themselves as decision makers or their people to this risk of moral injury. And that can be done with practice and engagement.
That's right. A very, very important point made there. The strength of character comes out in the worst of times. And Cyril Shroff, we always have choices. And moral decision is the key point to note here.
I think the real answer to the essential point that Simon is making is to find a way of sort of combining economic reality with an ethical lens. So just to take a very current kind of example, which builds on Simon's metaphor, is say redundancies or pay cuts as a result of businesses which were more deeply affected by the pandemic. A purely economic decision would suggest that you sort of cut jobs, whereas a decision which is both economic as well as sort of combined with a more compassionate lens should result in pay cuts, so that you at least preserve people's jobs and you're set up that when things do turn around, you're in a better position. So there are choices, and these are choices which many organizations have had to face, and there are people who've taken decisions on either side of this. So this is just one fairly simple example of how we have faced these challenges in the last 20 months.
That's right. I'm glad you picked up the point on challenges. And while there's just so much going wrong and you're struggling at every step, Simon, is ethics, does that become a luxury good at that time? How do you hold the highest standard of ethics in the most difficult times?
Well, it's not a luxury at all. In fact, it's absolutely necessary. It's in those difficult times that the things we typically look to, like rules and regulations, begin to break down, and you're confronted daily with the sorts of things Cyril was talking about, where the choices you face are not between good and bad and right and wrong. They're much more ambiguous. It's good versus good, the preservation of the organisation versus the income of the people you have an obligation to, and lots of other things of that kind. At that point, the decisions you make, at the critical point, at the crisis point, that lays down the groundwork for the kind of future you can enjoy when all the troubles start to recede. And what we know from harsh human history is that if you can emerge from a crisis with a sense of not just that you survived, but also that you are there for something that can motivate you, some higher purpose, some good that you contribute towards, then you will do so much better. But the danger is if you dump ethics when the crisis comes, then you'll miss the opportunity to lay that foundation for the future. So I think a lot of smart people have been realising you need to look beyond compliance, you need to look beyond the short-term requirements and have a sense of the future that you want to create for your organisation, where you can flourish, where you can do well. But you must, in getting there, preserve the ethical integrity of the organisation along the way. That is, if you want to harvest those benefits.
So Simon, to that point, yes, Mr. Shroff.
Simon, it's also about how you communicate that decision. Not only to take the right decision, but also how it is communicated.
That's right. And that communication, Simon, you'll agree, has to come from the top leadership in every organization. And how much of that is really taking place?
Well, there's a phenomenon which has been around for a long time called the moral muteness of managers. It's where managers will have very strong ethical reasons for doing something, but will pretend that that doesn't exist. Instead, they will dress up their arguments in terms of fundamental economics, the bottom line, and so forth, because they're slightly embarrassed about offering a sense of purpose, values, and principles. Cyril Shroff is right, though. The leadership needs to be able to couch their explanation for why they're doing what they're doing in terms that resonate with all of the different people who rely upon that. They need to be attuned to the different kind of ethical languages that people speak, and give a sense that the conviction for how they act is not purely made on short-term assessment of, say, profitability, but something more enduring to which people can commit. And this is becoming especially important for younger people who are entering the workforce and who are the source of the long-term value that can be created out of those commitments. So the quality of communication, which we're not often used to doing, has to change in order to take account of those expectations.
That's right, Simon. Very, very inspirational, words spoken by you, and especially from the new generation in the workforce, and some of them are making it big in a very short span of time because of the kind of social media presence and a different skill set required in the new age industries as well. But final word to you, Cyril Shroff. There is a huge amount of trust deficit in the overall ecosystem. If we have an unspoken language of ethics between the businesses, the government, as well as the society, it could really lead the path for the future generations as well.
Absolutely. I think ethics has to be the foundation of all transactions, whether they be between the state and the private sector, between private members of society as well. It's the only glue on the basis of which you can found this found all kinds of dealings between different elements of not only society but in terms of enterprise as well. So I think it's back to basics in terms of creating the ethical foundation and creating, to borrow from one of Simon's papers, the legitimacy on the basis of which deals are done. And to put it in an Indian context, I would resonate back to the ideas of dharma, which kind of always helps you distinguish between not only right and wrong, but also different versions of what is right. I think if we stick to that in a broader sense, that will give us the true north on the basis of ethical behavior.
All right, you brought up dharma, Cyril Shroff. I would add one more, that is karma as well. And the entire ethos is that, yes, the path to ethics and the right choices could be treacherous, could be difficult, but in the long run, it will be more value accretive. Thank you so much, Simon, as well as Cyril, for joining us on this very riveting and very, very important discussion at this point while we are on the path of sustainability. With that, it's a wrap. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Thought League.
Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2.
Focus. Ideate. Innovate. Enable.